Hi, everybody. Hope you're well tonight. I hope you can hear me okay. I want to check in with you now and see if you can hear and see me all right. Hi, Derek. Nice to see you. Hi, Dolores. Please let me know if you can see and hear me at this point. That will be very valuable. Okay, since I'm not getting anything, I'm going to assume that you can. And Derek says he's not getting any sound. Dale says good evening, all. Dale says the sounds fine at his place. Great. And how's the visual? Is that okay? Derek says he can hear and see me. Thank you, Derek. That's good. Okay, the topic for tonight is when will government financing informed by MMT perspectives become an issue in federal campaigns? So, the reason why I ask this question, of course, is that there are a lot of us now who've been trying to spread the news about MMT for quite a long time. I've been trying to do it myself since the beginning of 2010. I forget at this point whether my first post on the subject was in December of 2009 or was in January of 2010, but it was early. So, I'll be ending my 9th year soon. In 2010, I was the public face of a team of 5 people who organized an MMT fiscal sustainability teach-in and counter conference at George Washington University here in D.C. So I've been very familiar with MMT since that time. I've written a lot about it. I've got 7 ebooks on the subject that are out, and at Amazon, and all manner of blogs as well at various blogging platforms, including New Economic Perspectives, which for some time was the leading website in the United States for people who were blogging MMT. So I've been devoting myself to this for a very long time. And of course, the main figures in MMT, Warren Mosler and Bill Mitchell, and Randy Ray, Stephanie Kelton, Scott Fulweiler, uh, okay, and so many others have been blogging about it a long time, okay, as well. Now there have been 3 MMT conferences. Uh, and so things have been percolating for quite a long time. We've seen MMT articles now in major news sources like the New York Times and uh, okay, and the Los Angeles Times, uh, okay, and in Bloomberg, on the News and Opinion, at Vox, uh, all over the place. Okay, many outlets. Okay, Business Insider. So there's been a lot of public exposure now, but oh, hi Gary, how are you? It's nice to see you. But at the same time, it's not something that any of the candidates have been willing to talk about. And that is becoming increasingly strange because, of course, the arguments are once again starting up, asking how you're going to pay for this, how you're going to pay for this, how you're going to pay for this. We keep hearing these arguments. They keep getting raised by the mainstream press, in spite of the fact that more and more of the mainstream press people know that there is such a thing, okay, as MMT, and have read articles from some of their colleagues in the alternative media, such as colleagues at The Intercept. They've been hearing from colleagues on The Hill. Uh, they've been hearing or seeing the articles in the mainstream outlets, okay, I've talked about. They've been going to conferences like Economists for Peace and Security here in D.C., okay, and elsewhere, where MMT economists, okay, are represented, and they've been hearing that the opportunities for deficit spending are really there, and that the austerity gospel is simply nonsense. And they've been getting a lot of exposure to that particular point of view. Hey, Rob, how are you tonight? Hey, Steve, nice to see you. And so we're in a situation now. Oh, by the way, please share, okay, as much as you can here. I need all the help I can get still. And still, it hasn't hit the debates yet. It hasn't hit the discussions on how you're going to pay for it in the mainstream. Okay, now last night, Steve Grumbine was at the Convo Couch show, talking to Pasta Jardula and to Fiorella Isabel, and I thought that was a very successful discussion from the MMT standpoint. I think Steve did a great job in presenting the MMT point of view. He was very friendly and very personable and very cogent. And all in all, I think he did a great job. And it seemed to have a good effect on the hosts. I mean, I was very pleased about that. So perhaps we'll get some more attention over at Mikasa Sukasa than the MMT point of view has been getting. But at the same time, even though we're seeing a lot of small victories like this, the candidates themselves don't seem to know, okay, of MMT. Now, we know very well that there are some candidates who do know about it. There's at least one in the presidential race, specifically Bernie Sanders has to know about it because he's been hearing about it from his chief economic advisor now for some years. So he knows about it, but of course he sticks to the old methods of explaining how he's going to pay for things. When he's asked about how he's going to pay for this and how he's going to pay for that, he'll talk about sometimes having to raise taxes to pay for things when he knows very well he may not have to raise taxes at all. For example, he concedes the argument, I think he concedes the argument that he will have to raise taxes when he's talking to people who are asking him how you're going to pay for it, just because he wants to shut down that particular argument. And of course, he can say, okay, I'm going to raise taxes, but your overall costs, okay, are going to go down. He can make a plausible case for that with respect to Medicare for all. But what's he going to do when the issues of climate change and the climate emergency get hot and heavy, and he's asked, how are you going to pay for the Green New Deal? Well, so far, he's been answering that question, okay, by saying, it's not a question of how I'm going to pay for it, it's a question of how can I not pay for it? How can I not pay for it since it's going to cost us far more than the $16.2 trillion that I'm quoting as the cost to do something that's really effective about the climate emergency here in this country with the Green New Deal program. I'm saying $16.2 trillion, okay, is going to do the trick. And I'm saying we're going to be able to afford the $16.2 trillion simply because it's going to cost far more not to spend that $16.2 trillion on the Green New Deal. On the other hand, when you look at the costs, okay, of the Medicare for All program, as they're being quoted all around the internet, okay, at this point, and you look at the $16.2 trillion cost that he's been quoting for the Green New Deal program, which, by the way, I think is far too small. Okay, on the other hand, I think the costs that are getting quoted around the internet and that he seems to be willing to agree to are probably far too large, okay, for Medicare for All. But the point being, the point being, when he adds the cost of free college, the forgiveness of student debt, the increases he wants to make to Social Security, the housing program that he wants to support, which is very, very important, the infrastructure program, okay, that he wants to support. If someone sits down and adds up all of the cost estimates on that, it's going to become apparent At some point during the campaign, okay, I do not know exactly when. What I'm trying to do, of course, is raise the question here. But at some point in the campaign, I don't know if this is going to be in the primary, because if he's running against Warren in the primary, I don't know if he's going to be called out for this. If Joe Biden continues to survive, though, he may be calling both Bernie and Warren out, asking them how they're going to pay for it. And Buttigieg, of course, is going to do that too. They're going to be putting forward the austerity point of view, that there isn't enough tax money that can be gathered from America's elites to pay for all the programs. And that means we would have to go deeply into debt in order to pay for them. Of course, our debt is already at 22 plus $trillion, and to pay for all the programs over a period of 10 years, I'm sure that our erstwhile opponents on the so-called centrist side, I like to think of them as right-wingers, but on the so-called centrist side, are bound to bring up the issue of, well, this is going to be 30 trillion more than we can possibly tax, Bernie. Well, I'm just, kind of pulling that off the top of my head. I haven't costed out all of it. I don't think I'm going to bother, because I know that it doesn't really matter. So I'm not going to bother computing it. But somebody on the other side is going to compute it at some point. And so, at that point, what does Bernie do? What does Bernie do other than hand waving? Can he really get by saying, we're going to pay for this in the way we've always paid for it, if it's worthwhile doing, and if it pays for itself, we'll run deficits and we'll issue debt instruments. Okay, this is not going to be a problem. See, so far, he hasn't been admitting. He's been shying away, from actually admitting that to put through his programs, he will probably have to grow the debt of the United States. I'm not sure he'll have to grow the debt to GDP ratio of the United States. He might be able to argue that point successfully. But you can see that at some point there's probably going to be a fight over this. Now, I think he's fortunate that if he gets through the primary and he's the candidate, of the Democratic Party, and he goes up against Trump, that Trump is not in a very good position to attack Bernie on the issue of fiscal responsibility during a campaign. Not after those tax cuts and those deficits, that is to say, the deficits we're having now, which are considered to be very, very high deficits by the mainstream. So I know Trump is not in a very good position to do this, but whether he's in a very good position or not, to do it, it seems to me Trump is going to do it. I mean, Trump never shies away from expecting that people are going to forget what he did and what he said last month, or 6 months ago, or a year ago, or a year and a half ago. Now, I know Bernie's going to remind him of that, But then Trump is going to begin to exaggerate and to lie and to call into question the fiscal probity of Bernie's programs. So I'm just wondering when this issue is going to become a serious enough issue for people to really begin to discuss it in an honest way during the campaign, rather than trying to hide. Well, maybe I don't want to put it that way, but maybe I want to say, when will our politicians in the mainstream who want to solve our problems and know that it's going to be expensive, when will they try to educate people about the real monetary truths and the fiscal possibilities and the actual policy space that we have in order to solve our problems? The variety of things we can do to control inflation while we deficit spend, in order to solve our problems, in order to transform our society into one that is not only survivable, but that we can all be proud of. Now, to highlight this issue, what I'm going to do in just a minute is go over some articles which highlight in their own way the problem of cost. But before I do that, I want to remind you to please share, like, and subscribe to this video when you see the YouTube version that I'll put up at a later time tonight. And I also would like to ask you to please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. So thank you. That's my commercial message for tonight. I might give you a reminder later, but it'll be short. Anyway, to the articles. The first one is by David Badayan, the editor of the American Prospect, and it is in the American Prospect. Dave is now the editor-in-chief, of the American Prospect, and I'm going to take the time to go over this article with you. He says the Medicare for All cost debate is extremely dishonest. And the dishonesty he points to is that while Biden, and Buttigieg are constantly raising the issue of cost, there's deception at the heart of their own plans. Over the weekend, in Indianola, Iowa, Senator Warren announced that she would soon roll out specific details for financing Medicare for All. And, of course, that's going to be her answer to 1 week of getting, how will you pay for that, demands from the media and rival presidential candidates. Dave says, Dave, who knows about MMT, says that a nation with millions of uninsured people and tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths from lack of access to health care is consumed without talking about taxes, uh, rather than the revolution in human rights that would come from universal coverage, tells you a lot about life in the United States and why we still suffer from a broken system. And by the way, I was just watching, before this program actually went on, I was watching a YouTube a documentary. We both were watching a YouTube documentary on China and the fantastic changes that have occurred there over the last 20 years or so. And of course, these changes have occurred through the use of state money and through the use of a banking system shored up by state money, and a system that is in constant expansion, extending credit very broadly and very rapidly to entrepreneurs who are involved in executing the most ambitious of business plans on a very large scale, building in a hurry, in a frenzy of development that hasn't been seen before in the world. And this keeps on going year after year after year. When we talk about a slowdown, when we talk about a recession in China, we're still talking about 6% of GDP growth. Here we talk about 2%, and we get excited. Okay, so this is what's going on there, because they've been using the power of state money. Now, they haven't had the MMT doctrine, or the MMT approach to justify it. All they were doing is using common sense and noticing that when they used the power of state money, it worked. It worked like gangbusters. And it's still working for them. But I digress. But this triumph, of budgetary scolding is being applied unevenly. If we want to talk about, quote, paying, unquote, for universal coverage, we should expand the discussion to all the candidates who claim to support it. And of course, he's quite right. While Joe Biden and Mr. Buttigieg and others have howled about cost, there's a deception at the heart of their own plans. Either they put just as much health care costs on the federal government as the Warren-Sanders single-payer model, or they're effectively useless. And Dave, of course, I think is quite right about that. But there's the other side, which is dishonest too. And that other side, of the dishonesty is while Biden, and Buttigieg have been howling about the government cost, the deception that's at the heart of their arguments is that they don't want to talk about the overall costs that will be paid by the American people if we don't have a single payer model. If we don't go to single payer, those costs are going to be enormous, in the $49 trillion to $50 trillion range over 10 years. While if we adopt a single payer program, we have a very, 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 very good chance to keep that cost down to $30 trillion, $32 trillion, $35 trillion. And we have a very, 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 very good chance to save $15 trillion. But they don't want to talk about total cost. We've got to make them talk about total cost. We've got to make them admit that for the population of the United States, the Sanders single-payer model, and maybe the Warren single-payer model too, as soon as we see what her single-payer model is, she can't seem to make up her mind whether she's going to have one or whether she's still co-sponsoring the Bernie bill. But we have to get the others, Biden and Buttigieg, to admit on an apples-to-apples basis what their plans are going to cost. Because make no mistake about it, what Bernie is talking about is total healthcare expenditures in the United States, more or less. Yes, there might be some small amount more over 10 years. Let's say 2 or 3 trillion more over 10 years for healthcare spending that is non-federal under the Sanders plan. But what Biden, and Buttigieg have to be made to do is to acknowledge how much total cost there's going to be under their plan, where the government spends really just about as much as it's going to spend on the Sanders plan, but the private sector is going to spend an additional $20 trillion. They've got to be made to admit that that's going to be the case. And they've got to be made also to admit that they're going to have far more fatalities, far more divorces, far more bankruptcies, and far more mortgage foreclosures, and far more social deviance in general than will be a consequence of Bernie's single-payer model. So then Dave goes in talking about what Biden, and Buttigieg have separately proposed, public option plans that would compete with private insurance, and that, by the way, would probably do very little to bend the cost curve over 10 years. Dave points out they pitch this as a cheaper way to establish by universal health care coverage, but that claim relies on a hide-the-ball scenario. The Biden or Buttigieg option over time will either serve as a weak alternative to private coverage with high premiums substandard coverage, or backed by the government bargaining power, it will outshine private insurance and gradually supplant it. And so, as Buttigieg himself says, his plan will act as a, quote, glide path to Medicare for all, unquote. Now, this is not the first time we've heard about a glide path to Medicare for all. That was exactly the argument that was being made in 2009 and early 2010 about the public option plan that the administration was advocating for at that time, and which somehow got lost in the struggle with the Republicans and the centrist Democrats. I mean, we've been down this path already, including the claim that there was going to be a glide path to Medicare for all if we only passed the public option, if we only passed the trick sparkle pony. But the truth is, that glide path never manifested itself because the public option didn't get passed. It got junked by the Congress in the middle of the legislative struggle in order to try and get a few Republican votes, supposedly. Of course, none of those votes actually materialized. Not a single one. Not a single Republican vote for what became the Affordable Care Act. But the public option was taken off the table in order to get some degree of bipartisanship, which never materialized. By the way, that was a total failure of Nancy Pelosi's. At least we're to believe it's a failure if we believe what she had to say about the public option. But the truth is, in the first place, what came out of committee in late June of 2009, or was it early July of 2009, I forget, was a public option bill that at most would have covered 10 million people. And it wouldn't have been able to compete with the private sector, and it would not have created a glide path to Medicare for all. That bill was a bait and switch. Even if it had survived, it would not have been successful at all. The original proposal for a public option put forward by Jacob Hacker envisioned a public option plan that would handle 120 million people. 120 million people. Such a plan might have had a chance to create a glide path to Medicare for all. But the BS they were delivering in 2009 to us, that could never have done it. Going on. If it doesn't work, the public option will certainly be cheap, but it also won't help anybody in a meaningful scale. If it does attract some millions of customers, then in the long run it would approach a single-payer system. Not just millions of customers. The scale. We have to be precise about the scale. If it doesn't actually cover customers in the plus 100 million, 150 million, it can't possibly serve as a glide path. And if they produce another public option bill like the ones that the Democrats produced out of committee in June 2009, then give that up. A bill like that is never going to create a glide path to Medicare for all. But knowing Nancy Pelosi or others in the centrist area, of the Democratic Party, if we allow them to get away with it and we start to pre-compromise, that's the kind of fluff we would get out of them this time. They fooled us with it in 2009. As someone once said, we can't be fooled again. Yeah, sure. Anyway, Biden and Buttigieg take advantage of the fact that we use a bizarre and even faulty system to score legislation in the CBO, which only looks at a 10-year window for budgetary impact. If the public option is good, and it eventually becomes a kind of Medicare for all, the cost spike, the spike downward in cost, would all happen outside the 10-year window. So Biden and Buttigieg, or maybe he means a rise in costs because, there would be more people covered. So Biden and Buttigieg are lying about how effective their public options will be, or they're lying about how much they will ultimately cost. They can't have it both ways. Well, I think Dave has to keep in mind here that once we get closer to a Medicare for all system, that costs are going to go down. In fact, if we had 150 million people on a public option, that would probably start bending the cost curve downward. That's enough people to have enough weight to be able to outcompete the private insurance companies. So Dave says, and this indicates that he's aware of the MMT aspect of things. Notice that I'm using the deficit scold framing here. In reality, Medicare for All saves money, and even more than we expect. Yes, he's been talking to Stephanie or Warren. I mean, our Warren. But that is Warren Mosler. The infamous Mercatus Center study estimated that Medicare for All would save $2 trillion over 10 years due to lower provider reimbursements, administrative costs, and drug outlays. But the CBO recently looked at a relatively modest prescription drug bargaining proposal from House Democrats, which would directly negotiate prices on just 25 pharmaceuticals per year, and found it would save $345 billion in federal spending for Medicare. And Dave then says, if that's the payoff on just 25 drugs, increasing bargaining power across the healthcare space would presumably go well beyond $2 trillion. And that's just for drugs. The problem with cost debates on healthcare is that much of the current system is largely submerged, set up to hide the true cost to the individual. Quick, how does your employer-provided healthcare actually cost in total beyond just the number that shows up on your paycheck and in copays and in premiums? Most of us have no idea unless we work in a corporate HR department. When you surface these submerged payments, they feel like brand new tax burdens, but you've been paying them all along, says Dave. All candidates intending to shake up the system must deal with this tension, a feat they accomplish in different ways. Biden and Buttigieg play games with the budget window to keep those costs hidden. As journalists by Libby Watson has pointed out, they rely on the ignorance of the public and especially the media, who shouldn't let them get away with it. Really, it shouldn't be so hard to ask, quote, Mr. Vice President, do you expect your public option to be any good? And if so, wouldn't you face the same cost challenge you decry in other candidates' plans, unquote. I'd like to see Buttigieg fumble over that one. Sanders has put together a menu of 12 options to finance Medicare for All, none of which he commits to, and some of which, like the wealth tax, he has subsequently used for other proposals like his housing policy. But it does include an income-based premium that would replace insurance premiums and co-pays with middle-class taxes. On my reading of the Sanders bill, and off what he's been saying on the debate stage for so long, there are no premiums and no co-pays and no deductibles in his bill. Now, I suppose Dave could be considering here, and maybe one of the 12 options that Sanders had specified for financing Medicare for All, I can't actually recall. It could include a premium, that's income-based. But that's not in Senate Bill 1129 at this point. And I don't think that Bernie would be putting that into any of his bills, not without being dragged, kicking and screaming, because he's been promising all this time there would not be any premiums. Dave goes on. Warren has been far more vague thus far, refusing to offer a soundbite that shall raise taxes on the middle class and saying only that overall health care costs will drop, which is true, and the primary selling point for reducing the administrative burden of our current fragmented system. This has sparked enough concern that she's now turning to specifics. They're not as daunting as you might think. First of all, if you think about it from a rational point of view, insurance premiums are just forced taxes paid out to private companies that, in my words, are close to monopolies. Insurance, drug companies, and healthcare providers, instead of a public one, the federal government. Personally, if I'm going to have a monopoly, I prefer it to be the federal government rather than a private one, because at least we have some ostensible control over the federal government if we could manage to make our voting system honest again. and you add premiums to overall taxes, we pay a level commensurate with high tax single payer countries while getting health care far below their standard. We actually, when we add our premiums, our copays, and our deductibles to our overall taxes, we pay a level much higher than high tax the single payer countries. And 30 million of us don't get covered. Anyway, he goes on to say it breaks all unwritten laws of journalism, which apparently require reporters to focus solely on federal taxes to see things this way. But that doesn't make it untrue. I don't think it's an unwritten law of journalism either. I think it's just the journalists, okay, for the mainstream, know that they're verboten to do anything but focus solely on federal taxes. But even as it is, state and federal governments pay about 1.6 trillion of the current 3.6 trillion annual cost of providing health care. No, that figure is wrong. According to a 2016 study done by Himmelstein, okay, and Woolhandler, okay, and Himmelstein. I'm not sure who was the senior author, okay, on that one. They share everything. The estimate of how much the federal government paid in tax breaks and subsidies to private companies and for physical plants, plus this 1.6 trillion that Dave, okay, is talking about, the total came out to $2.5 trillion. Okay, that was $2.5 trillion back in 2016. It's probably more now. And by the way, the cost now in 2019 is up to roughly 3.8 trillion. It's a figure in the neighborhood of 3.8 trillion that is actually projected for 2019 by the Centers for Medicare, okay, and Medicaid, okay, as what we're going to spend this year. By the way, this fiscal year, okay, is over. So if they're measuring this based on the fiscal year, we can probably already find out what national health expenditures were in the 2019 fiscal year. Okay, but what I saw was the projection, and that was at something like 3.76 trillion or 3.77 trillion dollars. That comes out of dedicated taxes and general fund expenditures. The answer to, quote, how will you pay for that, unquote, question could be, first of all, we already pay for almost half. No! First of all, we already pay for 66%. At least 66%. It could be 67% by now. As of 2016, we were paying for 65%. And the projections were that that would go up to 66% by 2018. So it could well be 67% right now, 2/3, not almost half. The more costs you wring out of the system by breaking up entrenched healthcare monopolies, okay, by eliminating the middleman payments, setting drug prices like every other nation does, and forcing down the reimbursements, the more you reduce that remaining $2 trillion per year. The Mercatus study shrinks it to 1.6 trillion. With a dedicated effort, you could probably drop well below that. As to the rest, there are plenty of approaches. Yeah, the Mercatus study, that estimated everything on the side of the conservatives. Okay? It gave nothing to the idea that we could wring costs out of the system because of the structural changes that would occur in a Medicare for All system. As to the rest, there are plenty of approaches. An employer head tax achieves the semantic distinction of, quote, not raising taxes on the middle class, unquote. and would likely cost that or below what companies spend currently on healthcare. Let's not do semantic tricks, okay? If there's an employer head tax, then it's going to come out of our hides sooner or later, and would likely cost that or below what companies spend currently on healthcare. You could add modest copays and reduce that even further, or a healthcare premium fee on a sliding scale. Sanders' menu includes several taxes on the wealthy. We have a military budget that in no way needs to be as large as it is. You don't even have to get that creative to hit the number. No, that can easily be cut in half. None of this will probably matter to media trolls looking for an "I will raise your taxes" soundbite, but they're letting their slip show by absolving the Bidens and Buttigieg's of the world and the Klobuchars from having to answer that question while doing the Republicans' work for them through relentless, nonsensical right-wing framing. The truth is, we can have nice things in America, Stephanie Kelton's framing, by the way. We just have to tune out the noise. But if we can add more of Stephanie Kelton's framing here, if we can add some more of that particular framing, we don't have to worry about the size of the Medicare for All budget. In other words, debating about the relatively small details of cost might be something we would do if we were concerned about the policy space that was going to be eaten up by the Medicare for All program. Maybe we should be concerned about that because we got to devote more policy space to the Green New Deal program. But anyway, these debates over the Medicare for All budget don't seem to be concerned about that. So my point is that to be debating these details in this kind of way and making a federal case out of it with respect to the campaign denies the reality that if Sanders has to deficit spend partly for Medicare for All, if he doesn't have to raise taxes. In other words, even if Medicare for All ended up costing in the first year $3.2 trillion or $3.3 trillion, it would still be $500 trillion below what it would cost if we did not change the current system. And also, if we're already paying through our taxes for 2.5, 2.6, 2.7 trillion, then we only have to come up with deficit spending of $600 billion to pay for Medicare for All. So it's really our choice whether we want to raise taxes. Well, taxes don't pay for Medicare for All in the first place, as Stephanie Kelton well knows, because she wrote the article on that, proving that beyond the shadow of a doubt. The point being, taxes do not fund spending in terms of the operations of the Federal Reserve when it adds reserves to the Treasury spending account. The taxes do not get added. What happens to taxes is that they're destroyed in the process of settling the tax payments. And then the Fed adds entirely new money to the Treasury spending account. So, there's absolutely no problem in Sanders having the Fed add $600 billion to the $2.7 trillion that's already matched by taxing without adding another $600 billion in taxes. That's a policy choice. that Bernie can make. Yes, the truth is we can have nice things in America. We can have Medicare for all. We just have to accept the truth, okay, of MMT. And we have to educate about that truth, as Steve was educating last night. So, here's another article by John Walker. Oh, by the way, John Walker used to blog for Fire Dog Lake. Okay. And also, Dave Dayen was the editor who covered the Daily News, or actually the writer who covered the Daily News, okay, at Fire Dog Lake. For years, he did 4 blogs a day on various news items. Boy, he was amazing. The quality of his work, okay, was amazing, and he wrote extremely fast. I was blogging at Fire Dog Lake at the same time, but in the community section, and I was among the first bloggers at Fire Dog Lake to be blogging, okay, on MMT. And both of them, John Walker, okay, and Dave Dayen, had to have been aware, okay, of my blogs because they were very well attended, okay, and many of them had extraordinary comment threads. And this went on, okay, for a few years. So their first exposure to MMT is likely to have been from me, okay, but that's a side point. In any case, the title of this article by John Walker is How Warren Should Pay Before Medicare for All. So we know that Warren has said she's going to release a plan for this. And John says federal and local governments spend 8.5% of the GDP on health care. That figure may be right. I'm not sure. Health system tracker. Compare countries. 8.5% of GDP. GDP is about 21.5 trillion. So that's roughly 2.1 trillion. That's a little low. That doesn't square with the Himmelstein and Woolhandler estimates. Okay, so those estimates are that we spend more, that we spend really more like our governments spend more like 12% of GDP, okay, on healthcare. Now, of course, both in federal and state cases, those healthcare spendings are not matched by any measure, okay, of deficit spending. In other words, the taxes that are collected at the federal level are accounted for by crediting trust funds, which is really just an accounting record. But then the spending is consistent with what's in the trust funds, and so there's no deficit spending, okay, that's involved there. And the local government level, there's also no deficit spending, okay. So whatever that percentage is, 8.5% or 12%, I think it's more like 12%, but I can go back and compute it after the show. We're talking about that spending was matched by tax revenues collected from the public. So we paid for that 12%, and we also paid, private sector pockets paid for the other 6% as well, because our total healthcare spending in the United States by governments and by private involves 18%, okay, of GDP. Okay, mainly to provide partial coverage to the elderly and people with lower incomes. Other countries with single payer systems cover everyone for significantly less than that. In Canada, the government spends just 7.4% of GDP on healthcare. Uh, no, I think that's wrong too. He must be talking about the federal government there. The figure in Canada, okay, last time I looked, which was fairly recently, was that Canada was spending 11% of GDP on its healthcare spending. Its total healthcare spending was amounting to 11%, okay, of GDP. I don't think the UK was 7.7% either, but in the UK, it's possible to get down to 7% because the Tories have been starving the National Health Service there for years. And Labour before it also was doing some starving, okay, the National Health Service as well. Now, it's probably been starved in the UK now for close to 20 years. So they might have knocked it down to 7.7%. But I'd be a little surprised by that. I probably estimated at 9% in the UK of GDP actually right now. If we're willing to quickly and dramatically reduce our outrageous healthcare prices to bring them in line with international norms, we could cover everyone for what the government is currently spending. That is right, John. That is absolutely right. All Warren would need to do is redirect state spending to the new federal program with maintenance of effort by requirements like those found in the Beto O'Rourke and Joe Biden's plans. Single-payer activists love to point out that most other industrialized countries provide health care at half the cost, but are reluctant to have, or in some cases downright oppose having, Medicare for all pay similar prices. Even Bernie Sanders doesn't call for trying to get large reductions in national health spending, which is why he says his plan will require new middle-class taxes. Yet if we're going to have a massive fight over the system-wide transformation of 18% of the economy, there, he just said it's 18% of the economy there, so he knows that, right? We might as well rip the Band-Aid off of and truly transform all of it. There's little indication we're getting any significant value for the extra $1 trillion a year we spend on healthcare compared to other industrialized countries, especially given our poor health indicators. I think it's more like $1.5 trillion, folks. Almost any other use of these resources would be better for society. Bringing down the out-of-control salaries and prices in our healthcare system while increasing wages elsewhere would also go a long way to advance Warren's goal of reducing income inequality. If that is Warren's goal, I'm not really ready to concede that she's big on income inequality, John. It also gives a sound justification for a controversial decision to outlaw even the nominal private insurance found in countries like the UK. One of the few benefits of barring private insurance is that it strengthens the government's ability to drive down the provider prices even further. So again, we're going through all this. Why are Warren and Sanders going through all this? They're going through all this because they don't want to educate about MMT. Was that really the right move? Is it the right move now? Is it the right move now? I know there would be a battle royale over MMT. The mainstream press would just be joyously calling the two of them crazy if they started talking MMT. But there's an MMT movement now out there to support them. And we can be very, very, very loud. And we're represented now in a small way in some of the mainstream press. It seems to me if Warren and Sanders advocate for a modicum of deficit spending in order to do it all, not simply Medicare for all, it's wrong to do it on a program by program basis. What we need to do is to budget by program in terms of what we need to solve our problems. And then we have to address the question of how much we want to tax in order to pay for those things. The budgeting, of benefits, and the passing, of benefit bills needs to be separated from the passing of tax bills, because tax bills are not about funding the benefits. They're about draining the economy of an excess of money that might cause inflation. These two issues have to be considered separately, as separate issues. That's the only rational way to do it. No pay-go system. We got to get rid of pay-go. For Warren, it is the right political move. And John says, this gives Warren a strong new rationale for Medicare for all. If we drive our healthcare spending down to international norms so we don't need any new taxes or premiums, much of the roughly $20,000 a year working families pay in private healthcare will result in higher wages, or at least that's the economic theory. At least some. I mean, I don't know, if much of it is going to result in paying higher wages, but I'll say this, there are going to be some higher wages out of it. Some higher wages out of it. And if not some higher wages, at least there are going to be great savings through the Medicare for All program, which will feel like an enormous salary raise to people. It will be an enormous rise in disposable income, the biggest wage raise most of them have ever had. Voters will likely be willing to put up with many changes they're skeptical about if it translates into a large potential personal financial gain. I think that's right. The absurd complexity of our financing system makes it almost impossible to design a funding plan that will definitely leave everyone in the middle class better off unless we significantly reduce healthcare prices. As long as we keep national healthcare spending around current levels, even if you design a funding plan to mostly just tax the rich, there will still be a small percentage of middle-class workers who will be worse off. Even if it is just 1 or 2%, the news will highlight their story endlessly. Yes, the plutocrats will. But the point, to be remembered is we will reduce overall healthcare costs just by cutting the insurance companies out of it. We will probably end up saving 1/3 by cutting them out of it, cutting their administration costs out of it, cutting their profits on drug prices out of it, and after that, just having the new system with the federal regulators actually bargaining for prices, even if the bargaining is not hard bargaining, we're going to get down to saving 1/3 without even doing much squeezing, and it will only be fair because the administrative costs for the providers will be much lower on their side. I mean, an individual doctor won't have to deal with 30 insurance companies and keep 2 extra people on staff to run those bills and that paperwork through. As long as we keep national healthcare spending around current levels, even if you decide to fund it, no, I said that already. Okay. Single-payer activists often don't push for those big price reductions based on a political miscalculation that promising continued high salaries for the foreseeable future can win over doctors and hospitals to the cause. This is a massive pre-compromise that few openly talk about. But this strategy is flawed. The doctors have already lined up overwhelmingly to oppose Medicare. No. The hospitals have already lined up overwhelmingly to oppose Medicare for all. Since they're going to fight reform anyway, Warren might as well really hit them hard. We can either have the highest paid doctors and the most expensive procedures, the richest hospital administrators in the world, with a big new middle class tax, or cover people without new taxes if we pay prices based on international norms. The choice Warren now faces is clear, okay, and inescapable. I think Warren, that John Walker's point there is very, very good. Okay, that argument, when you make it, okay, to the middle class, look, we can either have the highest paid doctors, most expensive procedures, and richest hospital administrators in the world, and have a big new middle class tax to pay for it, or we can cover everybody, including the middle class, without new taxes if we pay the same kinds of prices that are paid in other countries. That choice can be put to the middle class voters, and we'll see whose side they come out on, theirs or the providers. So, anyway, I've said enough, okay, on this article, and I do want to get to the third one, but okay, my point here is not a breath of deficit spending is mentioned in this particular article. If the cost, okay, for Medicare for all should go up by a few $100 billion a year, every year, $200 or $300 billion, okay, additional deficit. Why is that a problem? It will still be the case, okay, that Medicare for all will be a vast reduction in total cost spending. There's no need to raise taxes to cover an extra $200 billion, okay, or $300 billion. It can be covered by the deficit. MMT teaches if you don't want to be taxed for the extra 200 or 300 billion, that's okay. There's plenty of deficit spending room in our budget as of now. Plenty of deficit spending room in our budget. An extra 200, okay, to 300 billion of that's not going to be a problem. Okay, so the third article I wanted to go over. Trying to plant 1 trillion trees won't solve anything. The article is from Wired, and it was written by, who wrote the article? Let me find the author here. The author was Adam Rogers, and it was done on October 25th, 2019. And let me erase that for you. There we go. And let me use clearly on it. Okay. Title of the article is Trying to Plant 1 Trillion Trees Won't Solve Anything. It says the same thing is happening with the Teraton Initiative. We talked about the Teraton Initiative here in the past, if you recall. The company behind it, Indigo, is a startup trying to promulgate regenerative agriculture with methods like relying on the species that instead of being annual replanted species or cover crops, okay, to reduce the need for tilling. What they want to do is to rely on plants that are perennials. Quote, we're encouraging farmers to use less fertilizer, fewer chemicals, and data science, okay, and microbiology to improve their yield. and get paid a premium for growing things more sustainably, said the CEO of Indigo. Teraton launched last June. Sign up, you get $15 for every ton of carbon sequestered, measured through the regular tests of soil health. Hey, wait, doesn't that mean the startup would need to pony up 15 trillion? The cash, the company says, will come from Indigo's venture money and eventually from a carbon market that will sell offsets or use government subsidies, should such a thing ever exist. Perry says they expected to have 3 million acres signed up in the first year, and instead they have 10 million acres in the first 100 days. World saved, except, well, math. One 2017 study of 150,000 sample points all over Earth said there was only ever about 133 billion tons of carbon in the ground. Max! Not a trillion, 133 trillion. 133 billion, sorry. There's a community of scientists who've been working on these issues for the better part of 20 years and who have published numerous papers showing what the soil potential of the plant would be. Okay, and Indigo chose to ignore those, unquote, says Jonathan Foley, an environmental scientist and executive director of the climate change fighting group Project Drawdown. And quote again, I just have to scratch my head and ask why they're doing that. Well, they're a business after all. Indigo disagrees, of course. And their CEO, Perry, says, quote, his argument is based on two premises, neither of which we know to be true. The first is that you can accurately estimate how much carbon has been lost from the soil, and that's really hard. The second piece is, his premise is that you can't put more carbon back into the soil than was there to begin with. I think we can say with a lot of confidence that's not true. There's no reason to think that nature was looking to maximize carbon in the soil. And the article goes on, it's possible to imagine agriculture as a kind of geoengineering of improving on nature's yields and productivity. It could also improve on nature's ability to put carbon in the ground. That would be transformative. But there's no evidence yet people can do it at a scale that can by itself save the planet. Implying otherwise might even be its own kind of moral hazard, encouraging people to keep on coughing carbon into the atmosphere if they figure trees and cover crops will save us. Fixing climate change is going to take systematic, nation-scale work. These kinds of solutions let countries off the hook. Let countries and transnational corporations get away with business as usual. Quote, if a single company could offset 1 billion tons of CO2, they should win the Nobel Peace Prize. But a teraton? You'd need 4 planet Earths to do it, unquote, Foley says. And quote again, it seems like a Silicon Valley hype cycle. Let's overhype the numbers, overpromise, and then in 5 years it'll crash, unquote. That could erode confidence in the whole idea of fighting climate change, he says. He may be right. Using land as a carbon sink is a great idea. Even the land knows it. It already absorbs 30% of all carbon. A recent report from the UN said that for a mere 300 billion, Earth could return deforested or abandoned land to pasture and sequester enough carbon to stave off the worst effects of climate change for 20 years. That's less than half the U.S.'s annual defense budget. The cost of firing 300 WeWork CEOs and reforestation and regenerative agriculture are great climate-fighting measures to sell to the developing world because they actually help other problems rather than inhibit industrialization. So, I suppose one of the points of this article is that to do the teraton initiative at the $15 per ton, the startup would have to pony up $15 trillion, and then would have to make some profit. So the startup would need eventually to spend $17 trillion a ton in order to reach the teraton goal. Okay, so obviously that's a Green New Deal plan that's going to cost an awful lot of money, and the teraton initiatives finance plans, thinking that the venture money and offsets or government subsidies would be able to generate the 17 trillion dollars involved. That is one big bet, and it's going to require a Green New Deal plan that, even to do what the Teraton Initiative is suggesting, not to mention anything else that might have to be done, because this article in Wire is suggesting that an initiative like the Teraton Initiative alone is not going to be enough. It's not going to be anywhere near enough. We're going to have to spend a lot more on other methods. And those methods are going to be extremely expensive. So we come back again to the idea that the $16.2 trillion that Bernie is estimating for his Green New Deal plan may not be enough, for all we know. We don't know how much we're going to have to spend to get the carbon out of the air. And I just noticed a figure today. I don't know if this figure is true, but supposedly 18% of the greenhouse gases in the air, are methane in the atmosphere. So that's actually a pretty high percentage. We probably want to draw that down to find some way of sequestering the methane again. Of course, we have to start with the carbon, because that alone would lower temperatures again, and perhaps begin to constrain the release of methane from the Arctic that we're beginning to see now. Anyway, the point is, the Green New Deal is going to be very, very, very expensive. And if you think that the how you're going to pay for it questions with respect to Medicare for All are bothering Bernie Sanders and Warren right now, wait until people start to talk about the Green New Deal and how Bernie is going to pay for that. And since Warren is only estimating, 2 to 3 trillion for her Green New Deal plan, she's going to be on the other side on that for sure. She's going to be questioning Bernie. Hey, Bernie, where are you going to find the dollars to pay 16.2 trillion for your Green New Deal plan? How are we going to pay for that? Now Warren is not saying that now because she's getting the fire actually leveled at her in relation to Medicare for All. But there's nothing stopping her, after she answers that question, from turning around and firing the same question back at Bernie with respect to the Green New Deal. So I raise the question again. How long, how long will it be until people start frankly talking about more details of the insights of the MMT approach, explaining to people why our United States, as a nation having a sovereign fiat currency, doesn't have to worry about 16.2 trillion in costs over a 10-year period. Not even twice that. Not even 3 times that. We can afford it. We can afford to pay for what we need to do to save ourselves. Even if Bernie decided to increase the public debt, even though he knows that doesn't really finance anything. But in order to pay for the illusion, in order to present the illusion that it's being financed by something, that he turns around and he sells all that extra debt. Then the MMT approach can easily explain and make the case to people that the size of the debt and the size of the debt to GDP ratio, neither of those things matter. Neither of those things are connected to fiscal sustainability. Neither of those things are connected to fiscal responsibility. That lesson has to be driven home to the American people. In the coming few years anyway, it may have to be driven home during this particular campaign. And I'm just wondering how long they can get away without making the case. Now, Bernie's MMT advisors know how to make that case. And many of us outside also know how to make that case. I'm just wondering when we're going to have to start to make it. So, that was my case for tonight. Let me go back to my normal view now. There we are. And let me go back to Facebook now and see how you're doing. Okay. There's such a delay on here between the time I make a change in the view. There it is. And the time the view actually appears. Hey, Jeff. Hey, Randy. Hey, Jim Bird. Plant pot carbon recapture. Yeah, plant pot for carbon recapture. Yeah. Yeah, that's the kind of crop that's going to help a lot. And Robinson, I don't think you got what I was saying. I know what the Medicare for All plans do. I was only saying those of us who understand it might not want to use words like free, thus opening up arguments by those who don't understand it. Yeah, Sharon Anthony Connors is right. Oh, Mad Hildebrand is here. Hi, Mad. Sharon Anthony Connors says, JFC, are you really going to get into semantics? All care will be covered 100%. No dollars involved. You will present your Medicare for All bill, and that's it. Let me go back to the beginning of these comments. Rob says, did you hear about Tulsi? I did hear about her. She met with the Mooch and a bunch of Wall Street executives. That was off the record. What does she have to hide? I'm beyond done with her. quite frankly, I am sick of her. I told you in the past something just doesn't sit right when it comes to Tulsi. The big review hasn't happened yet, but it's coming. For now, Tulsi is canceled. Yeah, I know. I have feelings like that too, Rob. I'm waiting to see what happens. I'm waiting to see uh, what is said by Nico House about this latest move by Tulsi. And Russ says, I was given the honor of being called an, quote, MMT crank, unquote, this week. Yeah, Russ, you're a real crank, I can tell. Steve says, I'll check YouTube later. Thanks, Steve. It'll be up. Jeffrey Denton has joined, and Jim says, hi, all. And Sharon Anthony Connors, are you talking about this? I didn't see that article yet, but it doesn't surprise me. It does not at all surprise me. Jamal Thomas was blogging about that actually today, or was live streaming about it. I didn't get a chance to watch that little piece. I was going to do it soon, but it probably comes from Common Dreams, I would think. I didn't have a chance to look, at Common Dreams today because I basically had the articles that I wanted to cover already, and I didn't want to add any new ones. If I'd seen that, though, I probably would have added that. Let me get this here, and let me just briefly check who the two leading economists are who were saying that. Oh, yes, Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman, yes. They are leading economists who are on the progressive side and who work a lot, on inequality. And they directly challenge the claim Medicare for all would involve massive tax increases, for the middle class. Yeah, they're right to do that. Yeah, they're right to do that. Not going to involve massive tax increases. Probably won't involve any tax increases, at all, but it certainly won't if they used any measure the deficit spending policy space, which currently exists in the federal budget. And Zuckman, and Saez are not even using MMT thinking because they don't. I'll probably talk about what they have to say next time. This is the kind of article that I usually pick up and cover. So I'll probably be saying something about it in the next of my live streams. Let me get it in here into my LinkedIn. So I have the link. And then I can easily delete it. Anyway, thanks for providing me the link and saving me the trouble later. Jim Rushford joined, Susan Eldridge joined, and Derek Blackmore joined. Susan Eldridge said, Warren also talked about a pathway to Medicare for all. Yeah, I know. That sounded like she was backing off Medicare for all. I mean, a pathway backs off of Medicare for all. Huh? Yeah, it's all garbage. Whenever they say that, they're saying, I'm not in favor, of Medicare for all. And Bobby Barnacote, is it Barnacote or Bamacote? I guess it's probably Bamacote. Joe Gomez joined. Jim Bird said Elizabeth Warren's plan is cover for donors to stop and delay Medicare for all. Yeah, I think it is. Robin Halsey's joined. Susan Eldridge says only cost sharing in the Senate bill is a $200 cap for out-of-pocket prescription costs. That's right. $200 cap per year for out-of-pocket costs. The House bill has zero cost sharing. Right. No copays at all. No premiums, no deductibles. The Warren bill from 2018 has a $250 a month cap for individuals and $500 a month cap for households. God. Warren, what's... God. Jim Bird, Elizabeth Warren is trying to console the establishment. She's trying to save the insurance companies. She doesn't want them out of there. Andy Blair joined. Hi, Andy. Nice to see you. And Rob says, I got a really good question about Medicare for All. Is there anything in the bill that will prevent the healthcare provider to still have the ability to send you a bill? Yes, there is. There absolutely is. In the House bill, and I'm pretty sure in the Senate bill today, in the Senate bill as well, explicitly, balance billing to patients is prohibited. Prohibited. It's prohibited in these bills. No balance billing, no copays, no deductibles, no premiums, and no balance billing. Balance billing gone. Absolutely. Sharon Anthony says, there are no copays. All care is 100% free. Nothing out of pocket. That's in the House bill. Nothing out of pocket. And no premiums either. Robin Halsey says, I don't think, in my opinion, I think it's constructive to our cause to exclaim free because those who disbelieve we deserve or can expect things to be in favor of the public will argue, quote, nothing's free, unquote. But perhaps better to say, quote, covered, unquote, versus, quote, free, unquote. Your thoughts on this? I think what they say over in Europe is they say that it's free at the point of service. Okay? That is, when you go to see the doctor, it's free. There are no copays. There are no deductibles. There is no balance billing. You present your card, you get treated, you go home, and that's the last you hear about it. That's the last you hear about it. And this applies to dental also, and for vision, and for certain other things. Currently, chiropractic is covered under Medicare right now. I think it's likely to be covered under Medicare for All as well, even though it's not explicitly mentioned. That will be an administrative decision. Sharon Anthony, who's JFC? I don't see any JFC here. Anyway. Steve Gonzo joined. Robin asks, if you're replying to me, I don't think you got what I was saying. I know what the Medicare for All plans do. I was only saying those of us who understand it might not want to use words like, quote, free, unquote, because thus opening up arguments by those who don't understand it. Jeffrey Ginter has joined, and Randy Hedgebeth has joined. Jim says, plant pot for carbon recapture, and Robin Halsey says, hemp is better, paper products, but paper products heals the soil, if I am not mistaken. There was an article about that from Ellen Brown not too long ago. She goes through it, Robin, so you might want to take a look at that article. I covered it here maybe 3 weeks ago, something like that. And Jim says better carbon capture per acre. And Jim repeats acre. And Russ says, I've got to call it a night. Enjoy your Sunday. Enjoy yours also, Russ. Take care of yourself. Thanks for coming. Okay, I hope you've been sharing. I certainly will appreciate whatever sharing you can do. That would be wonderful. I think Susan Eldridge says Bernie needs to add long-term care to his bill so it matches the House bill. Are you saying there's no long-term care in Bernie's bill? I thought I saw that in S 1129. I'm sorry to be quiet for this long. I'm looking to see. I'm looking to double check whether there is long-term nursing home care in the Bernie bill. I had been under the impression there was. Nope, I don't see it. It says home and community-based long-term services and supports to be provided in accordance with requirements for home and community-based settings under sections. No, that's not really long-term nursing home care. Yep, I think Susan is right about that. And I don't see it in there, at least not at first glance tonight. I'll look in more detail, but it may not cover nursing home care, in which case there's absolutely no doubt then that the House bill, H.R. 1384, okay, the Jayapal bill, is better, uh, and so because also it has a 2 year transition, where Bernie has a 4 year transition. Oh, I know it's in the House bill. For sure, it's in the House bill. I don't have to check that. Long-term nursing home care is in the House bill. I did a presentation on the House bill not so long ago, okay, if you recall, Susan, and I went through in detail all the benefits. And I'm absolutely sure it is in the Jayapal bill. No question about it. Okay, couldn't find it. Okay, so unless there are other questions, I think it's time to sign off for the night. No, I don't see any other questions or comments. So I'm going to say good night. I'll be back, okay, on Monday night, okay, as usual. Next week will be a little different. I won't be doing anything on Wednesday night, and I will be having a live stream on Friday night instead next week. And Susan Eldridge says, I think that's why single-payer actors wanted to match the House bill. It's a better bill, I think. Yeah, I don't doubt, okay, that it's a better bill. I compared the two bills also when they first came out, and I had the immediate impression that the House bill was a better bill, and that it's the House bill that's the gold standard. In other words, the Physicians for a National Health Program. They have been supporters of single payer for years and years and years, and the most active of supporters, okay, of single payer, have dubbed that HR 1384 as the new gold standard for single payer. They used to give that title to HR 676. Now they've transferred it to 1384. And Bernie's S1129 bill hasn't changed that. Now, just to add a point here, why is it the case that Bernie's bill did not match the House bill? Why isn't it the case? Well, with the 4 year transition, he has the 4 year transition. Because somehow he thought that might be more acceptable to people in the Senate. He's making a political calculation that he probably has to get more than 60 votes in the Senate. Now, of course, he doesn't have to get more than 60 votes, okay, in the Senate. He said himself he might pass this through using by reconciliation. And with reconciliation, he only needs a majority. He only needs 50 plus 1 in the Senate. But just in case he did need 60, for some reason, he probably thought a 4 year transition was more likely to get him the 60 votes. In fact, I think it was Gillibrand who wanted to collaborate with him on this bill and who sold him on the idea of having the 4-year transition. That's what she wanted. Okay, yeah, he wanted to get the other more moderate Dems to co-sponsor, such as Kirsten Gillibrand. Right. But why not have the long-term nursing home care in the bill? He knew about the House bill at the time. Why not have it in the bill? Because he was probably afraid of the cost question. He keeps wanting to avoid trying to challenge people on the issue of fiscal orthodoxy. What is fiscal sustainability? What is fiscal responsibility? He wants to avoid discussing those questions and fighting with all of official Washington on that particular question. So, but all the compromises he makes to avoid this. I mean, he could have been teaching MMT to the public during his 2016 run. Here it is, it's 2019. And he's still not frankly talking about it. And he's still going through political gyrations to avoid actually talking about it. And he's doing it now. He won't admit that deficit spending is no problem and explain why. Yet, among the first things he will have to do when he gets into office, if he gets a Democratic Congress behind him, and it's not a close election, among the first things he's going to do is repeal the debt ceiling law. Because he knows that that's what the Republicans use to hold things hostage. So he's going to get rid of that right away. Okay, that alone puts him in a far better position. Then he has time to educate the people about the basics, of MMT, without having to postpone any legislation that he might have to pass. So Don Adams has joined. I'm glad to see you, Don, but you're just in time to see me sign off, which is going to happen right now. So thank you all for coming. And I'll see you on Monday.